Hi, everyone. Thank you all for being here tonight on a very busy Tuesday night downtown. Plenty of traffic to make things interesting getting here. My name is Desiree Anderson Crow. I'm a professor in the School of Public Affairs, and I'm co-director of our Center for Community Safety and Resilience with my co-director, Dr. Sheila Huss here. And we're thrilled to have you here tonight. I want to thank a number of people first. Our Dean, Paul Teskey, in the back, who is here supporting these events and always does. We also have a bunch of students here tonight. I know that there are criminal justice students here. There are MPA and MPP students here from policy analysis and other classes. So thank you for being here and for sharing the evening with us. We hope it's going to be a great conversation. So this is the first of our center's new Thrive series of community conversations. And our goal is to make this as interactive as possible. We're going to talk about what the state of Colorado and our innovative governments are doing at the local, county, state level with regard to community resilience and preparedness for various risks. But then we would love to have a conversation with all of you and ask questions, answer questions, and so forth. And Dee Dee has put some prompts up around the room just to kind of spur our ideas. So feel free to get up, look at those. But to begin with, I guess I would introduce our conversation today just by saying that we all know that the risks that humans face are increasing. We have, a myriad of factors that are, Dee Dee's just setting this, you can ignore this for now. Myriad of factors that lead to pandemics, natural disasters, mass violence events, and others. And these are certainly concerning for everyone, but we also know that predictions suggest they're going to increase due to climate change, overpopulation, development patterns, and others. And while all of that can feel very daunting and make us feel fairly hopeless, tonight's conversation is rooted in this idea of hopefulness, in this idea that communities, in particular at the local level, we can do better, we can improve and learn from mistakes and so forth. And so our goal tonight is to talk about the ability and the processes through which communities can adapt and change and learn from past mistakes in order to do better in the future. So that's our goal tonight. We are going to be learning from government leaders who are working to make our communities and our state more resilient. We're going to talk about the local and county level. We're also going to talk about the state level in Colorado. So first of all, thank you for joining us and thank our panelists. I'm going to introduce our panelists. Oh, actually, in the order you're sitting, so that's very convenient. And their full bios are on our website, so feel free to go and afterwards and during our Q&A, ask them lots more questions. These are some of our state's leading experts in this area, so please draw on them for their wealth of knowledge. First of all, we have Elizabeth Cohen. Liz is the Climate Adaptation and Resiliency Manager in Denver's Office of Climate Action. If you know Denver, we passed this incredible bill to fund our climate action office and are doing a lot of incredibly innovative work. So Liz works in that capacity, but she has an incredibly rich professional background and educational background before that. She worked for NOAA as in science communications as a scientist for the University Corporation and Atmospheric Research, the cooperation between CU Boulder and NCAR. She worked in the National Park Service and the Climate Change Response Program in education and training. She's also worked with the White House Council on Environmental Quality during her master's program. She has a master's in public affairs focused on environmental policy from Princeton University. And she, like, her background is ridiculously interesting, and she brings all of that to the office in Denver. Marguerite Harden works with local governments across the state and their partners as the local resiliency manager for the State Department of Local Affairs, DOLA, in the Colorado Resiliency Office. She currently leads a team working on Colorado's first ever microgrids grant program and manages a regional resiliency planning and implementation process with over 150 rural jurisdictions across Colorado. So imagine all of those voices coming together and what it takes to manage such a process. So, and I will also say that the Colorado Resiliency Office is really one of the national leaders in Colorado. We've done so much that really is forward looking and innovative. And part of our research from the 2012 to 2020 looked at the role of the resiliency office, and because of some of the findings of how important that office has been to supporting local governments, North Carolina started such an office as well. And so what they do, I'm going to use one of their graphics as an example. And but the Marguerite holds a master's of environmental management from the Yale School of the Environment. And she also loves reading poetry to her cats. So I love that little tidbit. um, Finally, Ashley Solzman is chairman of the Boulder County Commissioners. And before becoming a Boulder County Commissioner, she was a Louisville City Councilor starting in 2013 and was mayor of Louisville when the Marshall Fire happened. And so Ashley comes to this with incredible personal as well as professional experience dealing with the risks that we face. She is also my graduate students, and I have been doing some research this year. Colorado is developing a statewide building code to deal with wildfire risk, and serves on that statewide board to understand and decide what this building code system is going to look like in Colorado. Ashley, before she went into politics and public affairs, she was an engineer. She has her degree. She was a product and process engineer. So talk about a shift in in perspectives. But I introduce them so that you understand the depth of knowledge and expertise that these three women bring to our conversation tonight. I want to start by just talking about this term resilience and community resilience in particular. Dee Dee, if you could put up that that slide. This is and there's also some handouts that will be circulating, but this is, I think, the updated version, right? I used to show the honeycomb version, and then, but this is how the state of Colorado views community resilience. And like the term sustainability, it can start to mean everything and therefore mean nothing. So I really want to talk about what resilience means, because we'll use that term a fair amount tonight. In the middle, you can see these 6 kind of concentric circles that are these different sectors that really describe and illustrate what community resilience is all about. It's about the risks we face from infrastructure, housing, the natural environment, and that our watersheds and natural resources face. But it's also about our health, social capacity, our economic diversity and strength, and things such as, income gaps and individual level economic stability and things of that nature. And then where a lot of the conversation in my own research and others in public policy focuses on this area of community, which is really about how much we trust one another and can depend on one another. The people in our communities who are more or less vulnerable to the risks that we face, trust that we place in government, and other concepts like that. So I like this figure just because it really encompasses what, if all of these are healthy and strong sectors, what constitutes a resilient community. And so this is kind of where the state of Colorado is, or how the state of Colorado looks at these issues. And so kind of understanding that overall picture, quite literally, is, I think, useful to our conversation tonight. And the reason we're starting with this conversation in our Thrive series tonight is because September is National Preparedness Month. And while we're not directly talking about preparedness as in, the traditional kind of go kits and evacuation and so forth, all of that is all of preparedness has to do with understanding the risks we face and what we're doing about those risks. So I thought tonight would be a good opportunity to talk about some of these things. So first of all, my first question to just kind of get us going this evening is to ask each of you if you could kind of reflect on this idea of community resilience, and if there's anything missing that I didn't mention that is really critical for our conversation tonight, for us to understand what really makes a resilient community. What's our goal? Feel free to hop in, whomever likes.
Well, as someone who works for the Colorado Resiliency Office, I thought that was the best summary of that graphic I've heard. But yeah, I think it was really well said. The ring around the outside said climate change. I think it's hard to talk about resilience now in this era without acknowledging climate change and the force multiplier it's going to be on all of the other impacts that our country, our communities are facing. And so, I mean, I don't think anything else was missing per se from that description, but yeah, I think that's a valuable perspective to bring to that graphic and everything our communities are facing. I am the climate lead for the Resiliency Office. I'm sure we'll get into that more during the panel.
Liz, yeah, jump
So
in.
I can you hear me all right? Everyone can hear me? Great. One of the things that I wanted to start off with is when I teach about resiliency, because it's new to many people in community, I often use that graphic as well. If I were to say, is there something missing? One of the things that I think might be missing from that is accessibility, potentially, like language barriers. There are some things that when I think about vulnerable people or populations, sometimes I think about some of the barriers of access that people might have, and maybe that fits into community or infrastructure or something. But that's something that I often think about. Potentially people who are unhoused or isolated, where do they fall within that? I'm not sure. So.
Yeah, and there is the equity sort of the three kind of embedded circles around the 6 concentric circles. There's equity, but we have, since releasing this framework came out in 2020. Since releasing it, we are moving towards IDEA, so inclusion, diversity, equity, and accessibility as more. But we're going to be updating the framework. Our framework is a 5-year long-term plan that the Colorado Resiliency Office leads and facilitates the implementation of. But we really do it through a cross-sector and cross-state agency process that makes sure everyone is coming together for resilience, since it is needed to be approached so holistically, as Dr. Crow really emphasized there. But yeah, we update it every 5 years, and that's some really good input.
Awesome, thank you. From my perspective, I think about it a lot about how much energy, effort, how much would it take to get back to equilibrium? So it could be for infrastructure, it could be for a person, it could be for any of those things on the chart that were talked about. But if you think of a mountain with a ball on top of the mountain, and if you push the ball off, it will roll down, and it would be very hard to get the ball back to the top of the mountain to equilibrium. But if the ball is in a bowl in a valley and you push it a little bit off the center of the valley, it will just come right back to the valley. And so when I think about resiliency or thriving or any of these things, it's for me about how much effort, energy, and time does it take to get that back to an equilibrium state. And if you have a resilient system, it will be more like the valley, where it's very simple to just get something back. You think of a bridge in a flood. If there's a flood and the bridge is a resiliently designed bridge, the floodwater goes under the bridge. There's capacity for it. Maybe it overtops the bridge, but the bridge can withstand the force. And then the flood moves along, the waters pass, and the bridge is still there. Very resilient bridge. When I first got elected to council, we had a bridge that was designed for a 5-year flood. A 500-year flood came through. The bridge was somewhere in Erie or somewhere in Kansas, and we had to rebuild the whole bridge and it took 3 years, not a resilient bridge. So I think of it as the amount of effort to get back to equilibrium.
Good way to describe. Thank you. So each of you kind of sits at a slightly different vantage point in terms of kind of the jurisdictional level, state, county, local government, or municipal government. County is local government. Can you tell me, describe some of the kind of major risks that you're focusing on? I know maybe start with Liz, since we're sitting here in the city and county of Denver. I know that with the Climate Action Office,
Mhm.
it's a really, maybe you can talk about how unique it is. I don't know
Sure.
how many similar offices are around
Sure.
the country and what you all are focused on.
Sure. So I'm in the Office of Climate Action for the City and County of Denver. And we are really, I mean, I think there might be one other office in the country that's around similar-ish to ours. So taxpayers, as you mentioned, in 2020 voted for a 0.25% sales tax, which is for every $10, 25 cents goes to the Office of Climate Action. So that raises about $40 to $50 million a year for our office, which means that we can do really great things. We started during the pandemic. The office started during the pandemic. So we had a little ramp up to try to get all that money out the door with starting a new agency. But now we have close to 80 staff that work in our office, and we have 6 different allowable uses for the Climate Protection Fund. That's where the funding goes. So some of the different offices or teams, I guess you'd say, within our agency, we have the Buildings and Homes team. There's a Green Workforce team. For those of you students, we'd love to have you work with us. Come apply. And we also help community gain the skills that they need for family sustaining jobs in the green workforce. We have our mobility and electrification team as well. They work really closely with the resilient grid work that Marguerite's team is doing. At the state level, my team is the adaptation and resiliency team, and I'll talk a little bit about what we do. And the other team that I didn't mention yet is our environmental justice team. So there's a lot going on in our office. One of the things that we have been focusing on this year is extreme heat. So we just had a heat summit series where we brought together community groups, nonprofits. We brought together different agencies across Denver, the city and county of Denver, and businesses to talk about extreme heat and come up with potential solutions for that issue. So that's something that we're really focusing on. I can talk about all sorts of different proposals for what we think is going to change. And we also have been focusing on air quality, poor air quality, wildfire smoke, just ozone pollution as well. I think those are 2 big ones that we've been focusing on for now.
That's great.
Great. Yeah, I mean, working for the state, we have some of the most diverse weather and bioregions within any state in the country, right? We have the Eastern Plains, the mountains, we can be experiencing extreme heat and extreme cold on the same day in this state, as well as extreme dryness and extreme precipitation on the same day. And so we see it all. And the way I like to think about it is not by individual disaster, but, and this might not be the most hopeful on the Thrive series, but the cascading impacts of each disaster and how they're all really intertwined. So, dry, arid conditions exacerbated by extreme heat causing more drought, that drought causing more arid conditions that make for a tinderbox for fires, how those fires cause then post-fire floods. And so you have these cascading impacts that I think we like to, at the Resiliency Office, focus on the common denominator and how we can work towards a more resilient future, not focusing on just one individual disaster or a natural hazard, and how also, coming out of the pandemic, everyone was really focused on economic development, and we could say, well, how does economic development influence our communities? And how can we take that conversation where everyone had resilience on the tip of their tongue And vulnerable communities, first being incorporated into federal funding requirements, like how can we use that as an opportunity to talk about broader economic and community development, and not get siloed in what the solutions are, but really find those common solutions.
Awesome. You guys are great. At the county, we have a two-prong approach. One is preventative. Preventing things is great. That's our ideal. It's much easier and much less expensive to prevent things, but we have disasters that we respond to all the time. So natural disasters, man-made disasters, socioeconomic disasters. Just in my time when I was mayor, we had I got elected mayor of Louisville in 2019, the COVID-19 pandemic 2020. So that was a big disaster and a lot of response and a lot of coordination at the local level. And then our police officers were some of the first responders in the King Super shooting because we're the neighboring jurisdiction to Boulder. And so we're actually a closer drive to the South Boulder King Supers. So man-made disaster had a lot of impact on our police department, a lot of impact on our community. And then we had the Marshall Fire natural disaster. And so those are just examples of types of disasters. But that we work on that.
I think, yeah, question.
Curious for education strategies that you should develop to get it that far down so the public. What are the efforts to make sure that they're knowing how they are, what they're doing, to accomplish that and I know there's support around that, but I don't know if there is an intentional effort of how to get communication and to the
Are you thinking, sir, about just the good works they're doing or about specific in an emergency situation?
yes.
All of that.
I think the frustrating part about climate change in my mind is that a lot of people don't really get how it's contact and how they're downloading the information and what's being accomplished. And I think it seems to me that a communication strategy is important in that, kind of accomplishment. It's sort of like how do you know about that? How do they know that it's not just a flavor of the month kind of.
Yeah, no, I think that's a good question. Let me add on that, which is how do you simultaneously communicate effectively and not just terrify people? And just a lot of science, social science shows that the more just like fear and the more fear rhetoric. Can you hear me? Is it working?
Yeah.
Okay. The more fear rhetoric we have, sorry, Dee Dee, I'm just like roaming. The more fear rhetoric, it just kind of paralyzes people. So yeah, go ahead. You've worked in science communication,
Oh, this
Liz.
is such a fun question for me. Thank you for asking this question. So this summer, we didn't really, we thought about this ahead of time, but not totally strategically because I was just new to my role. But we had a heat summit series. So we had like 32 different nonprofit organizations, 16 different agencies, all these different businesses, all come together talking about heat. And it was like close to 100 degrees outside and all the news channels. I think one day I had like 4 TV interviews. I was like sweating outside and then we were like going to the heat summit. It's like, one thing is just taking opportunities when it's already brutal out. I feel like the heat is our issue, especially because in heat vulnerable neighborhoods, it can be like 12 degrees hotter in some parts of Denver than in others in the very high tree canopy neighborhoods. So there's all this inequity that happens also with heat. We also don't have air conditioning in a lot of these older homes. People don't have access to cooling. So I think the timing of that was helpful. We also have a bunch of different programs that we wanted to let people know about during that time. So it made it a lot easier because Colorado Public Radio interviewed us and we were talking about go to this website. There are many cooling shelters that were available at the time and some of the different solutions that we had. We actually have grant now from the US Forest Service. We got $5 million to increase the number of trees that we've been planting in low canopy or low in high equity areas in Denver. So we could talk about all these things that we're already doing, which was really exciting to be. We think of our office as like the good news stories because there's so much great stuff coming out of the climate office that is helping people. We have solar panels that are not only producing clean energy, for example, but also all the money and that people are saving goes to people who can't pay their energy bills. There's a lot of great stuff going on. I forgot to mention that over half of the funding that we have through this climate protection fund goes to help underprivileged people, especially climate vulnerable populations. So it's really good news stories that are happening, that we're doing good work. Yeah. So, yeah. Yeah. So
So the
some of it-
question there is, how are you getting those stories out? So sorry, you're going to repeat it so then that way the people on
Yeah.
Zoom can hear too.
So some of it was just, I mean, that local media was really covering that. So that was really helpful. The mayor has climate as his focus. He just mentioned or made that a point during his recent budget meeting. So our also, I don't know if you've heard about our e-bike program. That's our office. Our social media following is like astronomical because our e-bike, it's like bigger than
Can you make sure
I've
that
tried
the
to get an
14-year-old boys in my neighborhood don't have e-bikes?
So we have a wildly popular program that's within our office. So we do get a lot of people who are signed up for our newsletter that goes out. People from all over the country want to follow what's happening because it's a pretty popular program. So that's just a little bit about what we're doing.
What other thoughts about communicating these tough issues?
I'd love to chime in. So in the 2013 flood, we learned a lot of lessons that our monolingual Spanish speakers in Longmont did not get the emergency alerts. And a lot of people that were English speaking, monolingual English speaking, did not get the alerts because they weren't signed up. And even though the government officials learned that, we didn't do anything to effectuate a change. So like there was a lot of effort put in and it was not effective. And come Marshall Fire, we had a lot of people not signed up for emergency alerts that did not get evacuation alerts. And we actually had a lot of, in that, not a lot, but some monolingual Nepalese speaking community members that didn't get alerts. And then the communication tower that was sending alerts out to cell phones burned down. And so you really can't alert people when the cell phone communication that was what you were relying on. That's not a very resilient system. You need some other systems. So we actually have changed a lot of how we communicate out alerts. There are two systems now, one that pushes more like the Amber alerts out in our community, but this is not a statewide system. And we also have one that you can pull additional alerts and it is in Spanish, but if you don't speak Spanish or English, then you still are at a disadvantage getting emergency information. And so there are definitely gaps we know of. We've tried to run state legislation to address that as well, and it has not been effective and gone through. So there are definitely gaps in the state for that's just emergency alerts. That's your real last line of defense is when the police come door to door and knock on your door and try to get you out. And that is what saves so many people's lives in an emergency. But that is definitely something that we know is a deficiency. We've been working to address the deficiency and it still exists. It is very challenging in today's environment because people don't read the newspaper, they don't watch the news, and they are really upset that they don't know what's going on. And so we have been trying a lot of different things. So we did, for emergency alerts, we sent a postcard to every single household and every single business in Boulder County with the how to sign up for emergency alerts. And we did that because we've gotten survey data back that the only way people know is if we directly communicate with them, which is a very expensive way to communicate. But it's at least effective. So you can spend a lot of money on something and have it be completely ineffective, or you could spend much more money and hopefully at least then it reaches your end user. And then we've put out, we tried this year for the first time putting out a county magazine. So we've like made our own magazine where 2 full pages were dedicated to emergency preparedness, getting people signed up for alerts, reminding people that neighbors helping neighbors is part of the program. Like if you are in a neighborhood and you know your next door neighbor is monolingual Spanish speaking, they might need extra information from you. And so be a good neighbor. If you know your next door neighbor is in a wheelchair, they might need extra help. If you know your next door neighbor, like during COVID, has little children and they work from home, they might need you to watch their little children during gym class while they're on their Zoom call. So neighbors helping neighbors is a huge part of it. But what you're identifying is a huge issue because people don't read the paper, people don't watch the news, and yet need to be informed and want to be informed. And so it's a huge gap and a huge issue.
Yeah, I thought that was really well said. The only thing I'll add, our audience at the state and specifically within the Department of Local Affairs is to support local governments in their communications to individuals. And so, we do, and I think we're talking about very different kinds of communication, both on like preparedness and mitigation, as well as like during the time of a disaster. But we support communities by providing planning grants for all of that. And one of our biggest emphasis is on trying to get communities, and this will continue to be a bigger emphasis as we go forward, to do pre-disaster recovery planning, preparedness planning, and that sort of work that is about making sure you have those communications within your community, and especially for smaller communities where, they're in Hawaii. I lived in Hawaii and worked in Hawaii on resilience for 5 years. It was the coconut wireless, but here it's more the like rural communities, like who pick up the phone. It's not as much of the social media that more urban communities would take advantage of.
I
Let's
have,
go for it.
so a couple different things that you all sparked some ideas that I had about what the city is doing. Besides, in addition to just sort of that news stories about kind of the heat summit and that kind of thing. We have Promotores Climacticus groups. We have 5 different nonprofit organizations that are community connectors. So they work in our nest communities. They're basically Denver, there's an inverted L. I'm sure you all are aware of that. But in some of these climate vulnerable neighborhoods, we have nonprofit organizations that are making relationships in the communities, doing all sorts of different things. Our tree planting program, for example, is part of that. For the past couple of years, they have been doing education programs on extreme heat and preparedness in those communities, as well as air quality. So those are really like connections, but community connections, and they relay to us, what community really wants in terms of our programming. So our first Heat Summit series was with all of those community connectors to learn about just a separate one about what their interests were and what they wanted to see from us. The other thing I wanted to mention was the Office of Emergency Management in Denver does a lot of outreach events. They had one event that I went to, and I was just I was astonished. The community was outside the rec center. They were giving away emergency preparedness bags. And the line went all the way around. There were thousands of people there. Yeah, I was like, what? And I was sitting at a table with like 100 little bags. And then I saw like just little bags, and they had like thousands of these emergency go kits that they were giving away. So the Office of Emergency Management has these really big outreach events that they do with community that is very well attended. That was one of my first days at work, and I was
Yeah,
pleasantly surprised.
it seems like we're talking about kind of both at the very interpersonal level, trying to meet people where they are and talk to them one-on-one at community events, and also try to, either push messages to them in an emergency or make them aware of the risks that they face. And I think Colorado, maybe this is me as a Coloradan saying this, but I think we've experienced more than our fair share of disasters, from, the 2013 floods that you've mentioned, to perennial wildfires, but of course, for the metro area, most notably the Marshall Fire, where we lost over 1,000 homes. And then, of course, we've also experienced far more than our share of mass shootings in Colorado. And so I'm left wondering, how do you address so many challenges while simultaneously trying to make progress on individual ones? It seems like a kind of tension between being very broad, kind of addressing a wide number of challenges versus going deep into any one of them. In any order, what are your thoughts about that tension?
I don't want to go first because I keep thinking of things when you all say your thing, so I want to go last. Let me switch it
I
up.
mean, I can kick us off because, our office was really established post flooding in the 2012, 2013 wildfire and flood timeframe, where we've just realized that the traditional route of responding to these disasters, flooding the communities with money post disaster, and then getting in, getting out. There's some sort of a report, post disaster report, and then it's done, is not the solution. We need to be really thinking more pre-disaster. And when you look at any of the FEMA materials, they have this linear vector that is like pre-disaster, and then this red like line that's like the disaster, and then post-disaster recovery, and like that's what it is. And what I've seen happen with Boulder and Larimer and all of these disasters that Dr. Crow is referring to, it's less of a line and more of a loop where you're always post-disaster recovery and coming back and doing pre-disaster so that it doesn't break. And then as you do that loop, it's hopefully going like this, where you're learning each time and getting better and honing those systems and adapting, which is, the key to resiliency. So yeah, you see that with 2020 wildfire season, not just Marshall Fire, but others that, Larimer County was responding to, and, they're just dialed in. And so you have these communities that have experienced these disasters, and as much as we can talk about, do the pre-disaster recovery work. And, it's really hard when you haven't gone through that disaster to make it feel like that should be your top priority amongst all the other priorities, including those individual things Dr. Crow is mentioning. But yeah, what we've done is host a peer exchange amongst local governments, those early adopters in sort of recovery and disaster planning, and then those folks who have gone through it a lot, so that they're learning from each other and speaking to each other, and across, emergency management to land use planning to all of these other things. So we do keep it fairly broad and engaging, but we pull in those experts as necessary.
For me, it's back to the hill and the bowl. I mean, where you have things that are very precarious, where you have that ball on top of the hill that if it gets pushed, it's going to roll down to the bottom and be very hard. And then you're going to have to be pushing that ball all the way back up to the top of the hill and spending all your time on response. That's just all you're doing is pushing the ball to the top of the hill. And you have to do that. If you have created such an unequal system that is out of balance, you have to push that ball back up, and it will take tons of time and resources. So identifying what your most vulnerable areas are, where that will take the most resources to push that ball back up the hill and create more bowls, more valleys, so that if the ball gets knocked a bit, that it can come back to equilibrium without much treatment, without much care. And for me, taking climate action is like the ultimate valley maker, bowl maker. We have so many disasters that are being caused by climate change and by the devastating effects of climate change. It's impacting residents in so many ways, like we heard, from heat to if you lose your home from a climate-driven wildfire, or you lose your home from a climate-driven flood, or God forbid, your family members, like that is going to push you so far off of equilibrium that it will take a lot for that community member to get back into an equilibrium place if they can. And then if a second climate disaster hits, and then if a mass shooting hits, and then if something else happens, and then if your grandmother passes, like all of those things set people back in a way that compounds. And so from my perspective, it's about building an ability for community members to thrive by creating opportunities that if something gets off balance, if you get in a car accident, maybe you have insurance. That's a good equilibrium maker. So having access to insurance, having backup plans, having a community to rely on having that fabric to say, hey, I need extra support, I need extra help, and getting that extra support and help. Those are all things that help make that bowl out of a mountain. And behind everything for us, in my opinion, is climate change. And so it is causing a lot of things that we had that we thought were bowls to turn into little mountains. And we have to address that. And so we have to do things that reduce carbon emissions. We have to sequester more carbon than we are right now. And that will help us to address all of these other disasters. So you have to take on those projects. And your point to communication is like the why, talking to people about the why. Why are you doing this? Why are you talking about this? It's like, because it's connected to everybody's life and livelihood in our community, and we need to take action together.
I love those answers. So when we are trying to make decisions on how do we prioritize things, the first thing that we do is we listen to what community wants, because we're really on the local level. So, what is this neighborhood really looking to do and why? And a lot of what we've heard from community members is that they want more trees. And at least in these vulnerable, and my focus is really in the vulnerable communities. Our part of the Climate Protection Fund is to prepare vulnerable communities from the impacts of climate change. That's what we can use our funding from in my adaptation and resiliency team. And a lot of what we've heard is that people want more trees and more shade. I think that there's many, and the other thing I was going to say is that if we can figure out things that we can do that provide multiple benefits to many different hazards. So trees, for example, provide shade on hot days, right? They help reduce flooding impacts. They help with air quality issues. They also help with psychological issues. There's all sorts of great things about trees. They also provide habitats for wildlife. I mean, they're magical because in the wintertime, their leaves go away. Like, what a cool thing, right? And then the snow can still melt because we have self-shoveling snow in Denver. So we were talking about all sorts of shade structures, and someone was saying, wouldn't it be great if they just went away in the wintertime? And I was like, oh, that's a good tree. So if we can think of things that can provide solutions to all sorts of different challenges, that helps in our decision making when there's multiple things that we have to weigh.
The focus on, all of these innovative and kind of forward-looking projects and programs that you all are working on really hits home that Colorado is a leader in so many of in resilience across the board, in communicating ideas and funding them, in supporting local governments and so forth. I would love, I only have a couple more questions, and then I want to really ask our audience to think about their own questions and so forth. But I'm curious if you could simultaneously think about, what you think we are doing so well, whether it's at your level or the state as a whole, or however you want to answer that, but then also what challenges we face going forward. What are the things that we haven't yet really figured out how to tackle, aside from, fixing climate change or something like that, but on the really on the ground kind of challenges. So if you could think about that for a minute, I think, there are a lot of great success stories across the state, but try to pick a couple of interesting things that you're proud of.
I'll jump in. I just gave a presentation to the state of Maine. We refer to them because the Department of Energy thinks we're doing one of the best jobs with our grid resilience funding. And so this is just top of mind for a specific win that we have. Dr. Crow mentioned I'm running a microgrid for community resilience program, and that is really designed to provide redundancy to our electric grid. When you look at Lahaina, Maui, when they had the fires and there could be no communications going out to any community members, that was because the electric grid went down. And if they had redundancy for at least the communication system, they could have avoided some of that social disaster. aspects. And so a microgrid is able to disconnect from the larger grid and be in island mode and provide that redundant power. And so just in 3 years, we have funded about $18 million worth of projects, nearly 30 microgrids across the state, and really have embedded a lot of the equity metrics that we now have growing out of the pandemic, where it was like, give these to vulnerable communities, but we're not going to give you a map for who that is or how to define that. Like, and no one wanted to be not in compliance with the feds, and so no one really knew how to define vulnerable communities. Now with IIJA, IRA, all the federal funding, and now also with state funding, we have the Justice 40 mapping tool. We have the Colorado Enviro Screen tool, which allows you to see not only what communities are most vulnerable or disproportionately impacted by disasters, but also why and what elements of their community are making them vulnerable. And then we can really support those communities. And of course, you have that nest and that inverted L. And so there are other local definitions for this. But we're able to use that equity data to really do outreach to those communities and try to really get them to be doing this preparedness and mitigation work, with microgrids as just one example. I think like 56% of our funding has gone to those DI communities, which I think historically, it's like, how good is your grant writer? That grant writer is going to be able to justify in all the different ways, with whatever data they can find, who their vulnerable community is and get that funding. And so I'd say that that's something that is a constant challenge, is that the higher the tax base, the more funding you have, the more of a climate office you can have. 80 people blows my mind. You grew so fast. But what we don't have is for those low capacity communities that are going to be hit the hardest by climate change, have some of the most vulnerable, don't have the capacity to take on these grants, don't have the funding for an 80-person, even a 1-person climate position. And so, we are seeing that exacerbated by the urban-rural divide. I think those are kind of the challenges that go along with this sort of access to funding and resources, especially around climate work.
So, is it okay if I go? So I wanted to follow up on the really cool stuff that you all are doing with your microgrids. One of the things that I think that the city and county of Denver is doing well is that we're really piloting some really neat stuff and seeing if it works, and then sharing out our successes and failures among other groups that might not have an office that is as big. So we're really an innovation office, trying all the different things and seeing what works. One thing that we are trying or that we've been working on is a resilience building. Our electricity resilience building is our Central Park Rec Center. Right now, we have solar panels that are giving energy to the grid right now, but if there's an emergency, it can flick a switch, and there's backup battery storage that we're hoping to put in there too, and just trying new things and then proving that it can work and that everyone can do it at a cost effective way. So that's something that I think is something that we're excelling at, is trying new things and trying to figure out how we can do new things as a new agency. Something that I think is challenging for us is that there's a lot of things that already exist, and trying to make those things better can be harder because they already are there. People already, so what do we do with these old buildings? Like, for example, what would we do with these old buildings that if we were to put in cooling, it would short circuit the whole building because of electrical wiring that's already there, or the windows don't open the way they could for heat pumps. And like, there's just all this stuff that's already built that if we're trying to make things more sustainable or more resilient, it can be pretty challenging for many different reasons.
The thing I think is working and that I'm most proud of is community members. And each time I have been through a disaster, I am overwhelmed by how amazing Coloradans are. It's pretty unbelievable. Like during the Marshall Fire, the water meters burned. And so you have an issue where water can the whole system can become contaminated because of a backflow issue where you have that exposure to the air. And you have the melted PVC pipe and other plastics that can get in and contaminate the whole rest of the water system. So we knew we didn't have expertise in-house to address this. We isolated those parts of the system and we started looking globally, who are the global experts on restoring your water system, your water supply after a wildfire. We had also contaminated in other ways. That's a story for another day. And so we started looking, and there are 3 people in the world that are experts in this. One of them lives in Boulder. Kind of unbelievable. Like, and it's true, like truly a world expert. And we flew the other 2 in too, just for good measure. So we had all 3 of them so they could argue with each other. And it was really great. And we got our system back up within about a month. And we believe that we did it in a really robust, resilient way. But we had those community members. Each time there's been a need of an expertise or a need or a want or a, we need volunteers, we need this, that. After the flood, I remember people picking up rocks, and it was like the most ridiculous looking thing you've ever seen, because you thought to yourself, if a front loader just went through here. But people wanted to help and people came out. So I believe like Coloradans and the spirit of person who either lives here or comes here is there's an independence, but there's also a sense of community, and there's a desire to be part of something bigger. And this part of something bigger while maintaining this total independence and sort of libertarian streak. It's sort of this fantastic mix. And I think that that really does help us quite a lot in an emergency, where people realize that like, oh, I am responsible to save myself. Like, oh, I need to take care of this situation and the people around me. And oh, by the way, I know my neighbor. So the community aspect of it is what I really think works. And I do think it's something about the culture of Colorado and the type of people who come to Colorado or either live in Colorado. There's still a lot of opportunity, like I think you nailed it, on communication. It becomes more and more challenging every year for communication. And the way communication works now is very interesting in that people hear the things that they want to hear, which is fascinating. And so communicating preparedness and resiliency and getting people on the same page to work towards something does become more challenging. So I think that's something we all need to think about how to work on. Subscribe to the paper if you've not already.
That is the perfect segue into, I think, in the spirit of National Preparedness Month, we've talked about what government agencies and communities are doing, but what can individuals be doing, whether it's in a collective manner, whether it's being prepared themselves? What do you think are the most important things that we as Coloradans could be doing in this, speaking through this lens of like trying to achieve more resilient communities? Go ahead,
Vote.
Liz.
Vote, 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 vote. Vote at the polls, vote with your wallet, vote everywhere. I think.
Vote.
I totally +1 that. And I would say we got these questions ahead of time, which is really unfair because I got to think about them. But what I had thought about on this one, and I do completely support your position. If I could get people in my community to do one thing, it would be, if you think about where you live, whether it's in an apartment or a trailer or a house, like you have 6 neighbors that you should know. And if you don't, like, go introduce yourself to your neighbors. Like that would be, if I could get every person in my community to introduce them, like you don't have to be best friends. You can disagree about how they park their car. You can hate their dog. All of those things are fine, but I would like you to know them just so you know who they are. And like, if you needed to, you could just walk up to them and be like, actually, I need your help right now. I have a flat tire, or actually I'm going through a mental health crisis, or whatever it may be. There could be a disaster coming. Like if every person in my community knew their 6 neighbors, we would be so much more resilient. That would be the number one thing. If I could get them to do 2 things, I would want them to know their 6 neighbors and sign up for emergency alerts. And then I have more, if I could get them to do more things, there are more. But those are the 2 things that I would really, if everybody would do that, we would be exponentially further ahead than we are now.
I want to know your other ones. Is
There's
there
a
another
lot.
one?
Go back,
Those are
look
the
at your
2. Those are the
insurance.
2.
Probably coming out
Insurance
of
insurance is in my top 5.
Okay.
So thank you all for those thoughts and for your perspective. I would love to hear from you all, questions you have, things that come to mind as we're talking about community resilience tonight, from your own experience, or great questions like, how do we communicate about these tough questions? Yeah.
1 moment.
Dee Dee has a mic. She'll be running around.
Hi, my name's Allison. I'm in the MPP program here. So throughout my professional career, you guys all touched on this a little bit. As far as how do you gather information from the community of interest? I've worked for many different nonprofits, and that was always something that we strive to do was gather information from the communities we were trying to serve, and really struggled with low attendance for like our educational programs or just kind of like low energy in general. So I was just wondering how you all go about incentivizing that community engagement so that you really have your finger on the pulse for what the situation requires.
That's a very good question. And that is right in line with what a lot of the research suggests, that people don't often engage. So in your experiences, are there tricks or cautionary tales or lessons learned that can improve that?
Sure. Paying for parking in daycare, like food for people who are participating. So, like if you can give like a compensation in some way to the people who are meeting with you. For community members, we do that. We pay the community connectors. So that's our promotorists that go out into community. They're all paid staff that do that work. So, so that's part of their work, is to relay that information. So they're not volunteering to come to our meetings. I think that in general, I mean, we're a pretty new agency. We've only been around 4 years, and a couple of them were during the pandemic. So I think that we see I'll say this, but don't quote me on this. But I think that we see individual community members less than we see representatives from organizations who come and represent community, like registered neighborhood organizations. We meet with like the representatives of large groups of people. Although for some of the work that we've been doing in the Globeville, Elyria, Swansea neighborhoods, there have been community members that have been going to those meetings, and the daycare, food, all those different things, I think really helps. So.
I mean, answering from the state perspective, obviously the state as a whole does do individual and community outreach. For example, the greenhouse gas roadmap that we came up with that defined how we would be reducing greenhouse gas emissions was hugely attended, and we did all of those things with offering food and payment and childcare. But I'll answer a little bit more with my Department of Local Affairs hat on, where we try to work with local communities and get them to sign up for resiliency actions, amongst a lot of competing priorities. And, the aforementioned like capacity issue in some of the rural communities, when you only have a very small town with very small staff, to ask them to take on another grant is asking them to not do a lot of other things. And so how do we work with them? Well, we have a model that is kind of the community by the community. We have 8 regional managers that are former electeds or former city staff or administrators, and they lead from behind. And so allow the local community and local government to define what they need, and then we match our resources to them and refer them to the other resources across state agencies, so that we have really built-in trust that, with those communities for helping them meet their priority goals. And that's, Dr. Crow mentioned the 150 jurisdictions that we got to work with us on a planning process post-COVID. Rural communities, especially, and this was a rural program, do not want another plan to sit on the shelf. So we were really proud we got that much participation within regions. So working regionally really helps those communities to partner on shared problems and solutions, which is much more also efficient and effective. But we did a lot of that leading from behind, and not necessarily talking about climate change, but maybe talking about those impacts of climate change, like drought or wildfire, that they are experiencing, and finding that common ground and shared goals to get that participation through trust and empowerment, really.
I think the first thing you need to do is define what you're trying to do. Like, do you want people's input? Do you just need to inform people about something? Are you trying to get a statistically valid sample? Is it a subset of the population you want to hear from, I think that that usually sets up a project for success or failure if it's been clearly defined. If you are really just informing and educating people and you ask for their opinion, they will not be happy and they will not continue to participate because they can tell that their input isn't actually being considered. It's just like you're taking it, but and so they'll feel like they'll know that you're wasting their time, and so they'll disengage. If you can actually power share, people know that too. If you do have the opportunity to say like, this is the pot of money that you actually get to decide what to do with, like you'll get participation because people know they're power sharing. So I think it's about really clearly defining what are you doing. If you have a small population, it becomes really challenging. We had a mobile home park we were trying to engage with, and it was there was an aspect of it that was informational and an aspect of it that was able to be power shared. And just because when you think of statistics and small numbers, like your sample size has to go way up if you want to understand the sample of a small number. So we ended up having to just door knock the entire community because that's what we had to do because it wasn't responsive to surveys. We needed to know. But if it's like county-wide, then statistically valid surveys, it's not that many that you have to sample from a county-wide sample. So I think it's just important to define exactly what you want to do and understand what tactic you might use to realize that.
Thank you. Great question. Thank you. Other questions? Yeah, let's go right back here and then Ale.
Hi, Eric Sycamore, graduated in '92 from.
We love it when our alums
USDA.
come back.
And my background is in climate, so I could talk to each of you three for another hour and a half. But you mentioned shootings, and I was really impressed with. I watched the press conference yesterday up in Boulder, post sentencing. Was impressed with the nods to the community staff. And I was curious if behavioral health comes up on anybody's radar, and I guess for you, Marguerite, statewide, does that even pop up as a local concern?
Health
they-
and public health?
Behavioral health
Behavioral health?
specifically, yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. And
And is anybody doing anything that you know of?
yeah, I mean, within the resiliency office, we have an interagency process, and this is going to be my long way of telling you that there's someone in CDPHE who could really tell you their answer much more specifically. But yeah, we would refer to some programs that they have. I can't off the top of my head tell you specifically what programs they have, but there is a whole department around behavioral health, and we do see that cropping up increasingly as a local issue. Do you have anything to add? That was in
I
your
do.
community. Yeah.
That I think you would be hard pressed to ask a district attorney or a county commissioner or a city council member if you asked about behavioral health that didn't say it's a major issue in their community. And I think you would also be hard pressed if you asked that same group that they wouldn't say that we desperately need additional resources at the state hospital. So the way the state hospital functioned in the 80s and 90s is drastically different than how it functions now. And so what we find, like our jail in Boulder County, we have over 400 people in jail and about 80% of them have a serious mental illness. And that is not how it used to be. So the people that were getting, so now we have a full-time psychiatrist that's prescribing medication, but we are not a hospital. So there's rules about, a hospital can force someone to take medication, a jail cannot. So it's really not the right place for someone who needs care. And yet that's where they are. So that the state system has shifted from the 90s to now to a place where people are they're still receiving government resources, but in my opinion, in the wrong venue.
Ale.
Thank you. The three of you have talked about the importance of collaboration, and I would like to know, like, in terms of collaboration across sectors and collaboration across different levels of government, what are the main challenges you have faced in responding to a disaster event that affect how effectively and efficiently you respond to that event?
I'm happy to start. So in Boulder County, we unfortunately have had a number of disasters in short period. And so we have had a lot of opportunity to collaborate together. And so our relationships are really strong and solid. During the COVID pandemic, it really tested a lot of things because everything was relying on pre-built relationships. So anyone who's new to local government post-COVID is sort of experiencing a different world that didn't have the benefit of learning and experiencing local government pre-COVID. And I do see that as a major challenge, particularly for people who are fully remote, to not have had the benefit of understanding how that collaboration works and how we rely on each other and why these partnerships are so important. And I was at a panel with a mayor from somewhere in Louisiana that had had like 14 federally declared disasters in her time as mayor since she had started. And, just like you just get into this mode where you're responding, and you have no choice but to rely on your partnerships. And so it's like your cell phone just becomes your lifeline. It's like, okay, I'll just start here and I'll call every person I know and ask for things. And you have to rely on one another. And so the more you have these relationships pre-built in, the better it goes. Stone Canyon fire that just happened in Boulder County. It was a great, if I could have videotaped everything to show you all, that would have been way better than listening to me for any period of time, but it was a really great show of collaboration. So we had the planning department comes in and they're sitting there with their GIS computers ready to answer questions to firefighters that are out there about what is this structure, what might be inside, what hazardous materials might be in it. So they're on direct communication. So they're sitting there ready to go on call at the emergency center. Right next to the planning department, you have human services with resources. They know how to get medications. They know how to get supports for families with kids in situations. Then you've got our agricultural team. They're taking people's livestock in. So like even just within our staff, the collaboration of staff, everybody knows where they're supposed to go and what they're supposed to do. And there's all this coverage that's mapped out. And it's only really unfortunate because we've had a lot of disasters, but everybody knows they have to collaborate together. And then the planning director goes out with the sheriff and a firefighter and they can co-respond because the planners have information that the others don't. So it's all about collaboration and that will help you recover faster. So it's another thing that will help us make a bowl out of a mountain is just collaboration.
Yeah.
You want to go?
I mean, I was just gonna say that that's a great example. I lost my train of thought.
Oh, I know. Oh, yeah. I just wanted to echo what the commissioner had said because I haven't really been part of the Emergency Operations Center in Denver, but we have, our Office of Emergency Management has been fielding crisis after crisis with the migrants and also now with our homeless population. So that has been a very interagency effort. Everybody has been working on that together and there've been tiger teams and it's just incredible how different agencies across the city have been supporting the Office of Emergency Management on those issues. So we have had our share of challenges in Denver right now. I'll turn to you.
Yeah, I would just add for communities that don't have a lot of experience in disasters, but are trying to build those relationships. I think that is the value of the pre-disaster recovery planning, where you're identifying what the major sectors are and who the leads are and how they're going to work together. And yeah, where those vulnerabilities are in those times of disaster and recovery. And part of your question was also about challenges when the sectors have not worked together. And I think that can happen sometimes with the volunteers after a disaster or VOADs, where, Red Cross or others just have their own mission and their own actions, but it's not necessarily coordinated with the local government or others. You have funding coming in from all different angles and, sometimes there isn't that central coordination or communication. And so that's also an important part of establishing those protocols and recovery support functions after a disaster.
And just one other thing, like having a really robust intergovernmental response is important. So like in the Marshall Fire, we declared our disaster right away, but the state doesn't have to declare a disaster. But because of our relationship with the state, like the governor declared the disaster in like record time. And because of his relationships with Congress and with the president, like the president had the federal emergency declared like on New Year's Eve, which is pretty unbelievable how quickly it all happened. And that relationship doesn't happen in every state. So elected officials at different level is really important that there's collaboration, or even like in Denver, like the city council and mayor have to have good collaboration, or county commissioners and local governments. And that is all about how resources get deployed to your area and how funding gets spent. And so like Congress members, then sometimes it seems, you'll see it on the news and people will say, well, this is strange. Why are they doing this? But you'll see Congress members from other states come in to look at a disaster. And it's not really a morbid thing or like a weird thing. It's just really to show like, this is what the resources are going for, and we appreciate your support and we need your support. And so it is about collaboration, of just like trying to bring people into the community so they can experience and see what's happening and talk to real people that are going through it and understand like why we need to help each other and why we need to support. It's easy to support your neighbors that you know. And so like bringing in some outsiders, so just so that they have a chance to see why we're human too and we need help.
I remember after the floods in 2013, Victoria Simonson, the town administrator in Lyons, told us, she said, it's a time suck, but we've vowed to always take the time to tell our story, whether it's a researcher, which was us, reporter, whomever, because we need to make sure Lyons doesn't get forgotten, but also help other communities that may also go through this. That stuck with me, obviously, 11 years later.
Yeah.
Other questions? Go for it, sir.
I'm just curious, how intentional is evaluation built into your budgets and the expectations of mini grants that you go out? What kind of, beyond the surveys, but like a meta-analysis, because a lot of the work and the success stories that you're talking about sometimes get lost if there isn't anything as strong as an evaluation. And a lot of organizations seem to forget evaluation as being part of their budgeting processes. So I'm just curious to know if there's an intentional way to actually grab onto that as a line item in your budgets.
When it comes to grant funding, the conversation around resilience metrics is really an important one right now that all states are grappling with. There can be evaluations that are more qualitative, and you can have some quantitative aspects in there, but to have uniform resilience metrics across your work is really difficult because, especially as a state, there's different threats and different needs across the state. And so we're making some progress on this, but I feel like the metrics conversation is the important, like how we're evaluating change and growth. And it's really hard because resilience is so holistic and local that, to roll these things up into an impact is really difficult, right? We do a lot of, and we even support local governments in creating metrics that are meaningful to them in their plans. And generally with resilience, there's a lot of outputs and inputs. It's not necessarily the impact level metrics or the outcome level metrics where you're saying, there is no baseline, right? And so like there's a disaster, you don't know if all of the pre-work that you did actually reduced the number of deaths, or right, because you don't know what it would have been without all of those resilience wins that you had prior. You just know we can never reduce risk down to zero, right? The goal isn't to reduce risks, it's to be more prepared for those risks and to mitigate those risks in advance. And so it's, resilience metrics is hard. I'm probably not saying it that well, but it's just, okay, it's hard. Yeah, it's hard to capture at like a high level. Yeah, what?
That said, you don't have necessarily a focus on putting something in your budget around that.
Well, when we do a grant, we have we have what they need to do in order to do the grant and it's not going to be closed out, or we're not going to pay them until they do the grant. So when it's grant funding, I feel like that's embedded in the process. In our planning processes, we also make sure that we have outcomes or, you know, strategies and goals that we follow up in our, you know, we have annual reports that we release. And so there is some of that going on in our planning and our grants. But yeah, I'm not sure where else we could be doing a better job of evaluating and rolling this up and communicating those wins better.
Liz, I bet you guys are doing a lot of evaluation on all of these
Yes.
innovative pilot projects
Yes.
of, is this working?
Yes, we are doing lots of different evaluation, especially because our agency is so data driven. So across our agency, I'd say it's very clear. For my team, we're a pretty new team. I just started a year ago and building up my teams. Same with the environmental justice team. They're really new too. We do have metrics right now. It can be challenging. Like we are counting the number of trees that are planted. We have like 13,000 trees that yeah, something like that. 13,471, I think. I'm like, it's in my brain somewhere. So we have, you know, how many we wanted to plant, how many the groups have planted, those kinds of things. But it's like, how much psychological benefit are those neighbors getting? We don't know. You know, how much shade. I mean, the trees are still young, right? It takes a few years for the trees to grow. We know how many trees have died and how many we've replaced. You know, there's those kinds of things. So it's really interesting, depending on what we're doing. What does success mean can be different, you know, so. And that was kind of.
I want to be mindful of
Yeah.
everyone's time tonight, and please feel free to stay and have conversations. But thank you for being here. Thank you especially to our three panelists who your wealth of knowledge and experience is really valuable to our learning. And I love this visual that Marguerite talked about, where, because in our field in public policy, we often get frustrated that governments aren't learning enough. But this idea of this cyclical but increasing kind of spiral. I love this visual that we can do better each time learning from our prior experiences. But I think if there's a couple of things that I'm walking away with tonight is that I'm going to go meet 6 more of my neighbors and I'm going to vote. What else? So thank you for being here tonight. And thank you to the
Thank
three of you.
you.